Okay, you can talk now. Your camera, brother? You can.
Thank you. Hey, should have me on one and my computer on the other?
So hang on a minute, we gotta get camera one up. Get that again. One.
So we're not using Lebronics today?
Nope.
I just put the last 10 minutes trying to load it.
Hold it on. Roger got it, didn't he?
Is anyone sitting in either of those two desks to your right?
No.
Would it be beneficial for us to have PowerPoint coming in?
No, not really. Just take notes.
Well, for some reason you can't get it on camera one. Right.
5 minutes early.
Okay, thanks, There you go.
Okay.
Use your computer, we got a picture of something.
It says using PowerPoint effectively.
Yeah, that's true.
Yes, that's, okay, that's it, yeah.
That's my computer. Then you got
Okay,
the
that's
other
it,
one.
I got you on the other one.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'll go ahead and pause it at break.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Okay, we have not met in a while, mainly because of my illness last week, and I appreciate your patience with that. I'm sure that you all agonized over not having class twice last week. I'm sure that there was some kind of a morning that you went through that at least there was some form of celebration in sure. Because of that, we need to move on. We had a couple more things that I wanted to deal with in Libronics, but if you all got my email with the links to those videos, if you watch those, you're really going to cover the last couple of things that I was going to talk about. One was note-taking, and the other one was copying Bible passages and that kind of stuff. So make sure you go back to the Logos website and look at those videos, and they'll cover those last couple of things. The other reason I wanted to do that was because I want you to get familiar with that website where Logos posts their training videos. It will be a good resource for you down the road because, as I've said from the very beginning, using Logos is a lot like Greek vocabulary. If you don't do it for a while, you tend to just forget about tools and where they are and how to use them. And I constantly go back to that Logos training website to refresh my memory on a particular tool, and I'm always surprised at the little nuances that I remember that I had forgotten. Something a tool will do or a little trick to using the tool that I had completely forgotten about. I use it all the time, but I didn't do a certain thing a certain way, and so it allows you to kind of refresh your memory. So bookmark that website. I strongly recommend that, and keep going back to that. Logos was about using technology to enhance your study and your sermon preparation and prepare yourself to teach. What we're going to get into today is how to actually use PowerPoint to make those presentations. I've entitled this Using PowerPoint Effectively, and I chose those words very carefully. I really do believe that there is a lot of PowerPoint being used out there ineffectively. I heard a laugh. Almost everybody in here, I would assume, at some point has been subjected to a lousy PowerPoint presentation. And, you know, we kind of, the way I look at it is this. You wouldn't experiment on your congregation on Sunday morning with a brand new preaching style that you'd never thought of before. You're just like, I'm just going to try this out, see how it. You don't do that. And yet, somebody will buy a copy of PowerPoint and say, well, I've never done this before, but we'll just wing it and see how it goes. Well, most of the time, it goes bad. And when PowerPoint goes bad, it goes bad really fast. And so I want to talk about being effective with it, how we can actually use it to enhance our message, to reinforce our message, rather than detract from it. It's a very interesting tool. Before you begin to use PowerPoint, I want to ask a few questions. One, come on in, guys. And I'm going to actually do something while they're here, since they're doing this, to see if this actually works. Hello.
Sorry, we're late.
That's okay.
We just had it in a robbery. The police.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, being busy. Are they going to come looking for you? Okay.
I was thinking.
Before you begin to use PowerPoint, first of all, how many of you have taught a lesson using PowerPoint?
I taught
Okay.
myself.
Okay. A significant number of you already have. And my question is going to be, why? I mean, why did you use PowerPoint?
Because I think most people today have become visual learners. When we just rely upon us up there speaking or ourselves as the visual aid, I think we're limiting what we can do in reaching the hearts of people for our Lord.
I tend to agree with that. Anybody have, Brett?
On top of that, from the studies that I've done, most people, like you kind of say, are not auditory learners. But here's the thing. They may be 30 or 40%, but if you use both auditory and you have something visual, then they are retaining somewhat. A statistic has been 70% of the information presented, and that's a big difference from just listening.
And we're going to talk about some of those statistics. My second question is, how many of you that have used PowerPoint to present a lesson have had some formal training in presenting lessons, either homiletical classes or preaching classes? Most of you are going to. Those of you that have already used PowerPoint that haven't, you will, obviously, while you're here. The second part of that question is, how many of you have had training in visual communications? You see, we gotta recognize that there's a difference between verbal communication and visual communication, and it's big. And it's one of the reasons why so many people do so poorly with PowerPoint, is because they know how to speak. They know how to give a good lesson. They know how to paint pictures in people's minds with their words, and how to organize their thoughts, and coming up with a central idea and breaking it down, and these are my subpoints and here's my conclusion. They know how to do all that. But when you start dealing with visuals, you've got a whole different ballgame to deal with. And you have to spend some time thinking about that. You have to learn, at least some ways, what to do, what not to do in order to communicate effectively visually. My subtitle for this class is The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And the reason is because you see the whole gamut of good PowerPoint. Well, what makes good PowerPoint good? Why do some presentations resonate with the audience and others don't? What makes bad PowerPoint bad? And what rules are being broken that are causing that reaction in the audience? And then flat out ugly is in the eye of the beholder, I guess. But we have to learn, you have to take some time to learn some things like color. You can't just grab any two colors and slap them up on the screen. Now, a lot of times it looks like that's what's happened, but you can't do that because there are rules. But as I've talked to people, I've heard some other examples of why we ought to be using PowerPoint, and I want to share those with you as we go along. One is because we live in a quote-unquote MTV world. Culture today wants everything to be flashy and visual, and while I think Rick is right that more people learn visually today, I really want to debunk this concept that we're competing with things like video games and MTV. Because, folks, we're going to lose. I mean, flat out, bottom line, we do not have the expertise, the budgets, or the equipment to compete in a quote-unquote MTV world. I don't know. I mean, some of you are video game guys, some of you aren't, some of you are into that kind of stuff. But have you seen the graphics that are actually part of video games and that kind of culture today? They're hyper-realistic. And our little fuzzy bitmapped picture that we downloaded from Google Images to try to reinforce a point that we're making ain't going to compete in an MTV kind of environment. Get that thought out of your head. We're not trying to compete with the media of the age. You can't. And even if you could, is it worth the money that would have to be invested? I mean, I had a visit at a community church a while back. There was an event that one of my kids was involved in. Just the money they have spent on television cameras in their auditorium is probably our budget for a year. And that's just covering the 3 television cameras and all the closed circuit stuff they have all over their building. We're not in that category. We don't need to be. We don't need to try to compete at that level. So reinforce the ideas that you heard from Brett and Rick. It's the fact that people learn visually that you should be going after, not that there's some competition between the television set, the video games, and the computer screen. The other argument that I hear a lot is we need to attract more youth, and in order to do that, we have to look more up-to-date and more contemporary. Well, okay, I buy that to some extreme, to some degree, but the bottom line is, again, when you talk to most of the youth, they laugh at what we try to do visually. I mean, compared to what they're used to in their high schools and in even their elementary schools, technology-wise, we're so far behind that they're like, this is kind of funny. So you got to recognize that, well, again, the hook is that I think more young people tend to be visual learners, as Rick mentioned. There's an attraction for the visual communications. Again, just because you start using PowerPoint doesn't mean young people are going to come to your congregation in droves. As a matter of fact, if you mishandle it, you're most likely going to drive young people to their DSs and their Xboxes and that kind of stuff because they enjoy those graphics a whole lot better than what they're seeing on your screen. You got to remember that it's still about the message. Bottom line, if you forget this point, turn off the projector. It's still about what you are there to talk to them about. It's still about communicating. And when the medium starts to affect your ability to communicate, you're missing the point. You have to constantly be reminding yourself, what am I trying to say? What do I want them to walk away with? Is it some flashy graphic? It better not be. It needs to be about God's Word. It needs to be about the gospel. It needs to be about how it can affect them in their lives. I really appreciated what Rick said in chapel this morning, except for the Wizard of Libronics crap that I thought was directly pointed at me. It's not about filling the screen with all of this stuff to show that you're smart or that you know the Greek or that kind of thing. It's about reaching people where they live with the truth of the gospel and showing them how it can affect their lives and should be affecting their lives. And you should be demonstrating that it affects your life too. And so if you can do those things with PowerPoint, great. If you fail at doing those things with PowerPoint, you know what? Turn off the projector and preach. I know I can think of 3 men off the top of my head right this minute who I really enjoy their preaching. I think they do a very good job. And over the course of the last 2 years, they've all started this PowerPoint thing. Got to do it. Everybody's doing it. I need to do it too. And I want to tell them, and I have told 2 of them, turn the projector off. it's so much of a distraction even to you as the preacher that you're out of stride. You're out of step because you're so worried about what's on the screen that you're not even making the connection with what you're saying. And so it not only is distracting you from the message, it's distracting your audience from the message. And you're better off just going back to preaching. I mean, just preach. That's what you're there for anyway. I love this tool. I think it's a great tool. But it's not appropriate all the time. You don't need to use it for every sermon. And you certainly don't need to use it just because there's some feeling that everybody else is doing it. It's the old, well, if everybody jumps off a bridge, are you going to go jump off a bridge? No, if you can't swim, you better not be jumping off the bridge, right? So, understand that there's a time to use it, there's a time not to use it. And just because you've invested money, I talked to one eldership that said, we invested a lot of money in that projector. I expect it to be used every time we have a worship service. Really? I mean, do you understand what it's for? I realize that an investment has been made, money has been spent, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a good tool for every sermon. There are some topics that don't lend themselves visually as well as others. And so we'll talk about that as time goes along. But understand it's still about what you're there to communicate. So let's talk for a little bit about audience analysis. Many of you are familiar with this concept. You need to know who you are dealing with in your congregations, right? I mean, who are you actually preaching to? What are their needs? What is their demographic makeup? That kind of thing. Usually, we tend to look at things like spiritual condition. Are they mature? Are they immature? Are they babes in Christ? Are they older members? We look at their age. What are their needs of seniors versus what are the needs of 20-somethings? What's their level of involvement? What's their level of Bible knowledge? You need to consider all of those things when you preach, don't you? I mean, one of my frustrations is Sunday evening lessons that are designed for usually babes in Christ. And when you really think about it, who do you have on Sunday nights sitting in your pews? It's typically not the infants of the congregation spiritually. It's the folks that have been coming for a long time. So you have to think about those things. But in addition to their spiritual condition and their spiritual level, we need to consider the culture that we live in. More and more, we are living in an over-communicated society. Folks, when you really start to break this down, it really starts to boggle your mind. And hopefully today I'm going to make you aware of some things, and I want you to be more perceptive of the world around you. Just look at these city streets, these pictures that I have of these city streets. How many visual things are going on? You've got signage everywhere. You've got things screaming for your attention. One author that I read said, driving through a major city in the U.S. is like driving through a dictionary. And when you really break it down, he's right. I mean, everywhere you look, you're being bombarded with some kind of visual communication. They want your attention. They want to tell you something. Or you're even just trying to figure out where you got to go, and you got to decipher this whole mess while you're doing 55 miles an hour, talking on your cell phone and listening to the radio. And anymore, you've probably got a little GPS thing saying, turn left at 2.8764 miles. What? We're just saturated with it. And it's affecting our ability to receive communication. And for you as communicators, it's affecting your ability to get through to your audience. You look at just the media explosion that we're dealing with. Statistics tell us that the average American is subjected to 4,000 messages a day. 4,000. You've got sources like advertising, television, books and magazines, newspapers, email, the internet, the computer. All of those things end up piling up are in your visual cortex, trying to get you to understand thousands of messages every single day. Here's an interesting statistic. America consumes 57% of the world's advertising. Now, if you look at a world map, we're really not a very large country, spatially. In comparison to some, we're actually quite small. And yet, more than half of the entire world's advertising is consumed in this country. We're only 6% of the world's population. And yet, we consume 57% of the advertising. Does that say something about the culture that we live in? It's just a constant bombardment of information. Advertising's everywhere. You just really can't get away from it. It's interesting that just after World War II, the per capita, in essence, the per person consumption of advertising in this country was $25. You know what it is today? Actually, this was as of 2 years ago. $357 per every man, woman, and child in this country.
What do you mean, per day?
Per capita, yeah, annual, per year, $25 a year was being spent for every man, woman, and child in this country. Now it's 376, excuse me, per every man, woman, and child. It's growing exponentially, and it's going to continue to get worse. Anybody know where this yellow book ad is? It's on the beach.
Let's say that in the sand?
They have actually figured out a way to take, they're like the road presses, the big steamrollers, and they can actually put a mold on the outside of that steamroller, and they drive up and down the beach. These are all Skippy peanut butter ads that you see in the background of this one. Now, that's just exactly what I want, a nice relaxing day at the beach thinking about Skippy peanut butter. You can't get away with it. Have you noticed in grocery stores now, where's the new place to put advertising in the grocery stores?
In the cart?
Okay, cart's one place. There's another place that I think is, it's popped up in the last couple of years.
TV screens?
It's on the floor. Have you noticed when you walk around, they have these little stickers on the floor that advertise something that's on sale. Or why is that?
Because you're always looking down.
We are so saturated with information, seriously, that people are turning their eyes down. Because everywhere else you look, you're being bombarded. So people tend to walk around like this these days. Well, so where's your eye? So now I got to put it in the sand. I'll put a sticker on the floor. At the mall the other day, they have this interactive advertising on the floor of the mall. It's a projector system in the ceiling. And little kids can actually interact with the advertisements. When they stomp on the ball, it bounces off the walls and other balls, and the kids love playing with it. Well, it's great for the kids. What's the advertiser thinking? Parents are watching the kid. What's the parent seeing? Buy these shoes. Use this cell phone. While the kid's chasing the little fish all over the floor that's running away from him because it's interactive. Mom and Dad are getting bombarded with some form of advertising. Folks, it's everywhere. And I really want you to start paying attention as you drive around the city, how much you're missing. I mean, how much you tune out. Because I think you're going to find out real quick that you're missing a lot. We'll talk more about that later. The average American family spends over 7 hours per day watching television. How much is it in China? Is television big in China for families? I don't mean how large.
I know it's quiet. I didn't really watch TV.
7 hours a day watching TV. It's ridiculous. That's over 51 hours a week. When you figure the average work week is, now in this country, it's 48 hours. But that's more than a work week spent in front of the idiot box. And, it really does do that to you. everybody's laughing. All these computer guys are laughing. Yeah, I don't sit in front of the TV. 24% of internet users say they spend 3 or more hours a day on the internet.
That's a TV.
24%. 3 or more hours. Now that's actually a deceptive statistic because 4% of those people say they spend over 7 hours a day on the internet. Now, okay, so what on earth are they doing? Somewhere between 3 and 7 hours a day on the internet. What do you think the number one most time-consuming activity was listed? Games. The survey went on to realize that this consumption did not diminish television time at all. The surveyors expected that television time for these people were going to drop because they were replacing TV with computers. Guess what? They were supplementing TV with computers. Their usage of both stayed the same. So these people that are still watching television 7 hours a day are on the computer 3 to 7 hours a day as well, in addition to. And the surveyors discovered that they were just eliminating family time to do it. I mean, they were cutting more and more into family time and family activities in order to do it. What's second most time consuming? I mean, somewhere we got to get to the point where people are using the internet to find information about current events so that they're more informed individuals, right? Searching for stock quotes. What do you think number 2 was? Most time-consuming activity they were using the internet for?
Chat or blogging?
Chat and blogging is number 2. Just yakking. Okay? What's number 3?
Email.
No. Actually, they discovered that if email were the only thing people were using internet for, it would actually be a very small amount of your time. Downloading music is number 3.
What about blog?
No, blogging didn't make the top 3. So, playing games, chatting in chat rooms and instant messaging, and downloading music were the 3 most time-consuming activities of the 4% of people that said they spent over 7 hours a day on the internet. How about newspapers? Does anybody here read newspapers?
On the internet.
On the internet. That's a
Not
good answer.
paper. That's screen.
American newspapers produce 10 million tons of printed material a year. Now, what's the big problem in the newspaper industry right now? Does anybody know?
Subscriptions.
They can't make a profit. How do newspapers make money? Do they make money on your little 75-cent subscription to your Sunday paper? Advertising. Why can't they make money?
Everybody's on the internet.
Because of the internet. And newspapers are in a real serious problem. But 10 million tons, that's enough reading to read 28 hours. If you read an average of 300 words a minute, an average Sunday newspaper in this country would take you 28 hours to read it from page 1 to the end. Now, those of you that said you read newspaper, that's of course how you read a newspaper, right? You start on page 1 and you just read all the way through, right? No? How do you read a newspaper?
Go to sports page.
Go to sports.
Funnies.
Go to funnies. Yeah. That's like it's just shooting fish in a barrel. I'm going like that. How do you read a newspaper? You skim. You look at headlines, don't you? You jump from section to section. Now, most people have a particular section they're interested in: sports, funnies, I know Eli's still looking for the internet section of the newspaper. But you tend to skim through headlines to find the things that you're interested in. What do you do with the headlines that you're not interested in?
Skip.
You skip them. You just skim. That's what we're into. This newspaper production, though, is 98 pounds of newsprint for every man, woman, and child in the U.S. every year. 100 pounds of paper is produced for you, just to print newspapers in this country, and we've stopped reading them. Why? Because nobody has 28 hours to sit and read a newspaper. You're not going to do it that way. And because of the internet. Just consider the books. Anybody like bookstores? Is anybody a book person? I'm a bookaholic. I like bookstores. As much as I like electronic books in Libronics and all that kind of stuff, I love going to the bookstore. 30,000 new books are published each and every year in this country. And we're just talking about the U.S. In essence, it's 17 years worth of reading if you read 24/7. It would take you 17 years to read 1 year's production of books. And guess what? Next year, there's another 30,000 new titles available. If you just even look at the periodicals, the magazine sections in your local bookstore, 80% of what you see on that screen changes every month. If you have a hobby, like I'm into photography, I've probably got 24 different periodicals that I can choose from, and they change every month. Not only does it get expensive, just the amount of time that it would take me to read even half of those periodicals every month and stay up with what I'm interested in staying up with gets ridiculous. And in those magazines, in addition to the material I want, what else are they going to give me? Advertising. They're going to bombard me every page they can with some other message other than what I'm even asking for. I want to learn about f-stops and depth of field. I don't really care about the new gizmo for my, well, I do care about the new gizmo for my camera, don't I? Isn't that the deal? We feed ourselves this materialism and we get involved in this that it just becomes, it snowballs. And so the more we spend, the more the machine tries to invade our space and bombard us with communications. And it eventually gets to the point where it just becomes too much. Consider going to the grocery store. The average size grocery store carries 12,000 items. I mean, it's crazy. If you look at the superstores, the new Walmart superstores, they can carry as many as 5 times that many items. 60,000 items in a Walmart store. I think it's ridiculous. Lynn and I have to take our cell phones with us when we go to Walmart because if we split up, I got to figure out where she is, and it would take me 30 minutes to find her. It's everywhere. It's going crazy. Look at the cereal aisle. You wonder why little kids are screaming in the cereal aisle, "Mom, buy me this, buy me this." There's hundreds of choices. And even within those choices, there's more communication and there's more bombardment. I took a 12-ounce box of total cereal. Guess what? There's 1,268 words on that box. Now, if you guys just wrote me a 5-page paper in this class, you just did, right? It's supposed to be 5 pages. On average, if you wrote 250 pages, 250 words per page, your 5-page research paper was 1,250 words. There is more information on a box of 12-ounce box of Kellogg's cereal than there is in your research paper. And the funny part was there was an offer on this 12-ounce box for a free booklet. Well, the booklet had 3,200 words in it. That's 1 box of cereal. It's crazy. We're just getting fried with information. You start to look at the business end of the world. American businesses produce 1.4 trillion pieces of paper each and every year. And 5.6 billion pieces each and every day. Now, why am I talking about all this? I mean, it gets kind of ridiculous.
Rainforest.
Huh?
Rainforest.
Rainforests, yeah. Levi, why does this matter?
Because technology is becoming more and more popular and things are
And we should
like
find a way to
newspapers.
get it much better.
Remember, we're talking about audience analysis. Why does this matter?
Nobody likes paper anymore.
Is it because they're getting bombarded with so much stuff that a little thing that we do on PowerPoint is not going to be stand out?
The people
Stand out.
sitting in your pews are dealing with this stuff day in, day out, 24/7, folks. They're the people in these American businesses that have to deal with this 5.6 billion pieces of paper every day. They're saturated with information all day long as they drive, as they shop, as they work. And welcome to worship service. Let's worship our God, and we're going to bombard you with more information. Now you not only have to listen to me, but you got to watch the screen and see the spinny stuff moving around and all of that kind of stuff as well. We get to the point where we've got filters that we turn on. Consider this. The Lord's Prayer is 56 words. The Gettysburg Address, 266 words. The Ten Commandments, 297, depending on your translation. The Declaration of Independence, 300 words. Some pretty heavy-hitting documents. A recent government order setting the price for cabbage in the agriculture field, 26,911 words. And your members have to chew through this stuff. You have accountants in your congregation that just got the new tax code. 672 pages. You've got people dealing with regulatory changes, governmental changes, educational changes, orders for this, new systems for that, and it's constant. Is it any wonder that people look like this? I mean, it just becomes so overwhelming that there's no escape. There's no place to hide. Nearly 1/2 of U.S. jobs now can be classified as information occupations. They're dealing with information. It used to be that jobs in this country had edges. And what I mean by that is a lot of the jobs in this country used to be occupational from the standpoint of manufacturing. My job was to go in and build a widget. And I used this assembly line to build this widget. And I worked from 9 to 5. At 5 o'clock, I can't build this widget at home, can I? I need all the stuff at work to build the widget. So when I'm off work, guess what? I'm off work. Information jobs aren't like that anymore. Jobs don't have edges. It's about trying to come up with a more efficient system for maximizing profits in the Western region. Well, you know what? After 5 o'clock, I can still be figuring all that out, can't I? I've got my laptop at home. Instead of being shackled to the office, I've got my laptop on my lap at home while I'm watching American Idol, trying to figure out how to maximize profits in North American region for, XYZ company. We don't ever turn it off. There's no edge to our workday anymore. What used to be an 8 to 5 because we did a particular thing in a particular location has now become 24/7. Things like laptops and PDAs and the internet have given us the opportunity to take our job with us wherever we go, whenever we go. And there's no way to turn it off. And that's really going to start to be, it has started to become a problem already, but it's going to continue to make the problems worse. Because we don't know how to turn off things. We don't know how to shut down. One of the coolest things for me was my first trip to Africa. I went to Chimawa, which is south central Tanzania. 12-hour drive from Dar es Salaam. Guess what? No internet, no cell phone, no email. It was awesome. It took me about 4 days to get used to it, though. I was like, somewhere there's got to be an internet. I got to be able to send somebody an email. And after a while, it was just nice to turn it off. Now, what do you think the biggest bummer of it was?
Getting home.
Doing what?
Getting home and seeing all the emails.
When I got back after 3.5 weeks, I had 1,200 emails in my inbox. 1,200. Did I have to figure out how to go through it? What? What was that?
I just erase them all and
Yeah.
stop and pray.
Yep. And if they really need me, they'll call me back. I have an uncle who works for the government who tells me he gets 400 emails a day. A day.
Erase them all.
Now, how do you deal with that onslaught of information? What do you think he does?
Kick him a say to read it.
He deletes them. I mean, he has no choice. You can't deal with 400 pieces of information a day like that. If he gave each one 1 minute of his time, you're talking about 400 minutes a day just dealing with that. And some of them obviously require a lot more than 1 minute. And so we just get to the point where we're just oversaturated. We just don't know what to do. We're experiencing sensory overload. Now, with that background, it really should not surprise us some of the reactions we get. Preacher, did you know that you preached for 29 minutes today? What's the deal? Usually you're 22. You know, I can count on you being 22 minutes. We get out at 11:20, and did you know today it was almost 11:30 by the time we got out? Don't you think you could have saved some of that information for next week's sermon? The people who watch their watches, I mean, preachers standing in the pulpit, you ever notice people going, I love it. I've always heard the story. I think it's a preacher story. I don't know if it's ever true. But a clock in the back of the auditorium that has a sign on it that says, "Remember Lot's wife."
Yeah.
I don't know what it means when a preacher looks at his watch. Absolutely not.
Absolutely not. But don't we get complaints sometimes about the length of a sermon if we run longer than normal? Sadly, and I don't mean that as a criticism, but when you see what people are dealing with day in and day out, can you start to kind of understand at least a little bit why they feel like they just need a break from the bombardment? They need to shut it down somehow. Now, how do we typically turn it off? This is the funniest part to me. What's the American idea of turning off the bombardment?
TV.
TV. It's like, let me bombard myself with just noise, visual noise. It is. It's just visual noise. Anybody watch commercials? I mean, you catch yourself watching them. Do you have any idea what they're about? We got our filters going. We're not paying any attention at all, but it's just this mindless, programming that's going on. And to us, that's turning off the bombardment. Is give me 7 hours of more bombardment. It makes no sense. I want to try something with you and see if this actually works. How many of you drove past a billboard on your way to school today, or on the way to this class? Okay, everybody ought to raise their hand. How many can tell me specifically one billboard and exactly what it said?
Said, repent and believe. It was here from the Church of Christ.
Okay, there's one. Give me a second.
There's a dental sign that says perfect teeth on Yale.
What else does it say?
I don't know.
Yeah, something. Anybody else? I mean, come on, guys. You guys must have driven past dozens of billboards on your way here, Eli.
There's a sign, I'm not sure what it's for, but it has a big golden M. Red background, golden M in the
You
center.
are writing it?
That's Mark Einstein.
Anything to do with
That's
food.
delightful.
McDonald's?
You're lovely.
What did it say?
Over 10 billion sold.
Yeah.
No.
What's going on here? The truth of the matter is we've learned to filter things out. When you drive, you have visual filters on. It's like skimming through a newspaper. It's the same thing. We just, if it doesn't register with us the minute we see it as something we're interested in, we move on. And our brain doesn't accept it. We've learned to tune it out. Scientists have actually determined that your brain has a capacity, and no jokes about some capacity larger than others, but to retain information that's relevant. I mean, once you receive so much information, it's like it's, we always say, in one ear, out the other. Well, guess what? To some degree, that's true. We don't let it sit long enough to process it. We just let it move by. It's like, I don't have time, I don't have interest, it's gone. And we do that with billboards all the time. I mean, when you drive home today and when you drive back to school tomorrow, pay attention to billboards and just see how many there are that you don't even notice anymore. You just don't even see them. And it's because you've got your filters on. They don't seem relevant. You've got too many other things going on, too many other things to process, so you just simply tune it out. It's that simple. Guess what? People in your audience are filtering every day, all day. Especially in this culture, they're doing it all day. Why on earth would we think that they're going to turn the filters off when they get to the church building? They do it so much, it becomes second nature to filter things out. And so we have to recognize that people are going to have their filters on. They're going to be listening to some degree, but with those same filters that work like the billboards, if you don't grab their attention, it just blows right by them. And that's why, after 22 minutes, they start going, how much longer is this guy going to talk? I mean, good grief, he's already talked for 22 minutes. They're not listening to you anymore. They're more interested in getting to, black-eyed pea for lunch or beating the other people to the restaurant. Yeah, I mean, their mind isn't with you, and it's because somewhere along the line you have activated their filters. Your job is to get through the filters. Your job as a communicator is to get before them and grab their attention and keep their attention long enough for them to hear the message that you're trying to present to them, right? I mean, isn't that what we try to do every Sunday morning when we preach? I mean, you didn't spend all of that time in Libronics and all that time putting together a sermon just so that as soon as you opened your mouth, they turn on their filters. I mean, you could have just said, everybody just go home. You've got something important to talk to them about. The goal is to get them to pay attention to you and the message for somewhere around 22 to 25 minutes, 30 minutes, 40 minutes, however long you're planning to preach, right? That's the goal. You have chosen a tool in PowerPoint that is designed to take attention away from you. Here your goal is to get them to focus on you and your message, and PowerPoint is designed to do exactly the opposite. It's designed to get the attention off of you and onto that screen. How many times have you guys looked at that screen during this class? Well, all the time. And when you're not paying attention to it, you're paying attention to me. These two things have to be synchronized. What I'm saying and what you're seeing have to relate. They have to intertwine. If they don't, guess what happens? Bingo, filters on. He's babbling now. It makes no sense. I'm looking at a picture of a cat. He's talking about salvation. I don't get what a cat has to do with salvation. And so, filter time. How long's he been talking? See, I'm not interested anymore. I'm driving by you like a billboard. Right? I mean, do you get that? If there is any kind of a disconnect between what you're saying and what they are seeing, you lose. Game's over. And I would be willing to say it's very difficult to get them back during that interval. Once you lose them during a sermon, the odds of you getting them back before the end of your sermon is slim. Would you agree with that guy? Ray, Rick, you guys preach once?
I've never had it happen.
Now, one of the members of your congregation is here. Should we ask him if this ever happened?
You don't realize. You don't realize. He swore me to secrecy before I got here.
Now, don't get me wrong. You can recover. I mean, sometimes you just hit a dry spot in a sermon or, something doesn't register. You can get them back. But once the filters are activated, it's a lot harder. You got to grab them again. There's got to be something to get them re-engaged in your message. And so that's why I say most of the time, when there's a disconnect, you lose. And that's the struggle with PowerPoint. Because you're adding a level of complexity to your message that is 3 and 4-fold what it is with you just up there speaking. If I'm standing before a congregation with a Bible in my hand, what typically do they have to pay attention to?
You?
Me. I mean, I'm the deal, Now, they can start to zone out and read the bulletin and all that kind of stuff. We haven't even mentioned all the other things that we put in the pews to distract them from your message. But the reality is, if I'm standing up there, I'm it. I mean, they have to at least acknowledge me and pay some attention to me being up there. When there's a screen up there with words on it, what's that little picture he's got up there? Oh, in the upper left-hand corner of that screen. I wonder what that is. Oh, maybe it's a projector. It kind of looks like a projector. I think that's a projector. I think maybe it's a projector, but why use that yellow color? I mean, that yellow is just, I hate that. It doesn't work. And it's really kind of green more than it is yellow. And now for the last 30 seconds, I have not heard a word that you have said as the preacher. I'm looking at the typo. You want to really be distracting, and we're going to talk about distraction. Put a misspelled word on a screen, and people are like, "Does he know that he misspelled that word?" He knows. So maybe I should say something. Now the whole time you're here preaching, but the chatter in the background in their head is, man, does he even know about spell checker? I mean, come on, everybody knows about spell checker. Or is it spelled wrong? Maybe it's Let me write it down on the back of the bulletin. Yeah, I think it's spelled wrong. We have given them reason to not listen to us. And that's why it's even that much more important that these two things be connected, that they make sense, that they make a logical progression, that they're interwoven to the point where I don't care if you're looking at the screen and just listening to me or you're watching me speak, you're getting the same message. And that's where 90% of PowerPoint fails. You need to help your audience connect personally with the message. You need to help them understand the message more clearly. You need to help them see things in a new way. And you need to help them remember. That's really what it's about, isn't it? I mean, if you don't make that personal connection with your audience, hey, it was a great lesson. I have no idea what I'm supposed to do with it now, but hey, he yammered on about Acts 17 for a long time, and it was pretty cool. And they leave the building, and they've got no clue what to do with it. If, like Rick was talking about this morning, you get up there and just want to talk about all the new Greek vocabulary you learned this week. Well, hey, it sounds really special, but I don't understand any of it, and so guess what? I'm on my way to. Is he going to go much longer? Maybe he's almost done. Did I hear him say in conclusion? Half the time you expect a cheer to rise from the congregation and you have to help them see things in a new way. Now, This is where you're going to get from me that PowerPoint is a visual medium. There are people that do not agree with me in this point. They have a right to be wrong, that's fine. The thing that makes PowerPoint effective is that it's visual. It adds to what you're saying. If all you're doing is repeating yourself on the screen, you're not taking full advantage of what this tool can do to help you communicate a message. Let's look at some statistics about the way people remember. People remember 10% of what they read. They remember 20% of what they see. So visually, we have a tendency to retain twice as much information through our eyes as we do through our ears. And that's everybody. You know, we talk about some people are visual learners, some people are auditory, some people are kinesthetic. The truth of the matter is, as human beings, we tend to retain more through our eyes than we do through our ears. Whether we're audio learners, auditory learners or not, we tend to remember more through our eyes, what we see. We remember 30% of what we hear. And we remember up to 50% of what we see and hear at the same time. But not just a repeat. Statistically, what this is talking about is a visual that goes along with what's being said, not just the words that you're saying repeated on the screen. And this is my biggest complaint about PowerPoint, is that most of the time, people are going to say, you must be baptized to be saved. Guess what's on the screen? You must be baptized to be saved. It's the exact same words. There's no visual. Basically, you're allowing the audience to read what you're saying to them. So what? I mean, that really doesn't leverage this idea of seeing and hearing. Memory, yeah. Right?
Would you also agree that it might take away from your presentation for about 5 seconds as they look up and see exactly what you just said?
Absolutely. When you engage them in reading the screen rather than listening to what you're saying, the chances for filters to come up are stronger. Because now you may be talking about the first 3 letters, first 3 words on the screen. They're reading the 12th, 14th, and 15th word on the screen. So you've given them a chance to blow past you as far as what you're talking about. The other interesting thing about that is that we tend to, memory experts will tell you that if you want to remember people's names, what's the best technique to remember people's names?
Relate it to something.
Relate it to some visual thing in your head, okay? Their face is round, so think of a bowling ball or whatever, you know, Joe Bowling or whatever. But to create a visual in your head that you can associate with that particular person, right? I mean, have you guys heard that before?
Yeah.
That's one of the strongest memory techniques, is to come up with visuals that you can associate with their name, and that way you recall the visual, the name comes back to you. That's what they're talking about here when they talk about 50% of what they see and hear. You need to give them a visual representation of what you're saying, not just repeat the words. Now, there are a lot of guys that preach just by putting their outline up on the screen. Is there some benefit to that? Yes, there is. There is some more retention by repeating. We know that repetition is a way that people learn. But again, leveraging the greatest advantage of this tool isn't just putting your sermon notes on screen for everybody to look at. It's using the visual medium to reinforce what you're saying. The bottom line is people remember when you involve more senses. When you stimulate their senses, more senses, they tend to remember things more clearly. Now, we typically don't have this opportunity as much in a sermon environment, but audio, sound, is another way. So if they hear what you're saying, they see it on the screen, and they hear it as well. They hear some sound effect or some stimulus that helps their auditory, they can remember even more. The more senses you involve, the better. Smell is a tremendously powerful memory cue. I don't know if it's happening, and obviously you can't do that in a sermon situation. But have you done something with smell?
I made brownies one time. Showed up, apron and the whole thing, and made the brownies in front, showing that if I was going to make the brownies or get what the front of the box shows, I need to follow all the directions. You can't leave out the eggs. You can't leave out whatever. I gave the brownies to somebody. They put them into the oven. And you talk about that 22 minutes towards the end. Boy, people were all, this is good.
Yeah. They used to say that movie theaters would spray popcorn smell into the air conditioning systems in movie theaters, and they would increase the sales of popcorn. Because when you smell popcorn popping,
Come on.
I mean, I got to get to the snack bar. I'm sorry, but it triggers something in us. Have you ever had a smell that brought back a childhood memory, or something that happened a long time ago? You smell something, and it could be food, could be wet grass in the summertime, or the smell of a lake, or something along those lines, and you immediately trigger back to some event or some time past. Does that happen to most of us? I think it probably does. Our senses are all tied up in this. And the more that you can involve their senses in grasping what you're trying to communicate, the better off you are. Now, there's a hazard. If you overdo it, the opposite effect occurs. So, when it becomes chaotic and lacks logic, retention actually goes down. You would actually have more retention by turning everything off and just talking to them, okay? Because at some point we reach that saturation, that sensory overload, and we just go, you know what, this is too much. I'm going to look at my watch, I'm going to read the bulletin, I'm going to do something to distract myself until this guy quits yammering, okay? So, recognize that you can overdo it, and this is another very common problem. We just start to throw so much stuff at people through these visuals that they freak out. Their brains just shut off. I mean, I just don't want to have to. I don't want to have to work this hard to get what you're trying to tell me. So we got to make it easy for them. The question that you need to ask yourself when you do PowerPoint is, how does this reinforce what I'm trying to say? And you need to ask it about every aspect of your PowerPoint. How does this background reinforce what I'm trying to say? How do these words reinforce what I'm trying to say? How does this picture, this image, reinforce what I'm trying to say? And if you cannot answer that question clearly and simply, turn the projector off. Back away from the remote. And preach. Because, folks, this is the problem. Earlier I used the illustration of a cat. That actually happened to me. I had a preacher, I'm looking at a PowerPoint screen of a kitten's face. Cute kitten, little bow, little bell. He's talking about redemption. I never did get the connection between why I'm looking at a cat and what he's saying. And you know what? The whole time I'm having the same conversation. It's like, why is there a cat? It doesn't. He's talking about redemption, and what does a cat have to do with redemption? But it's a cute cat. Look at his eyes. That's a good photo of the cat. And he's furry, and oh, look, he's got a little bell on. And you start eventually just getting lost in the image or asking your question. It happened to me recently. Those of you, and I already told Neil I was going to do this, so don't feel like Neil can't know. About 2 weeks ago, Neil preached a sermon where there was a picture of a Rose Bowl float on his PowerPoint. Does anybody remember that? Was anybody here? Did anybody do the same thing I did for the first 2 minutes that was up there and go, why is there a picture of a Rose Bowl float on this slide? There were two pictures. One was about what the text was about, and the other was a Rose Bowl float. And it was not immediately apparent as to why there was a Rose Bowl float there. And I'm having my normal conversation with myself. Why is there a Rose Bowl float on it? What is that a Rose Bowl float of? I can't.
Yeah,
Looks like there's some palm trees, but is it the company that's related to what he's talking about? Is it the kind of flowers they used on the Rose Bowl float that's the kind? What? I'm wondering, and I wanted to lean over to Lynn and say, why is there a Rose Bowl float? Now, when he got to that point, it made perfect sense why it was there. He tied it all together. But for going on 3 minutes, I've got no clue what he said. Because I'm distracted by the visual. It didn't make sense. Logically, my brain was trying to put two different puzzle pieces together that didn't go together. And I'm trying every which way to figure out how they fit together. And in the meantime, he's still preaching, right? I mean, the preacher doesn't stop while you have these little conversations in your head. But I've got no clue what he said. And I told him afterwards, I said, I'm sorry, but I lost you at that point. Now I got it back. But what could he have done? Well, don't bring the picture of the Rose Bowl float in until you make that point. If he had just waited 3 minutes to make his point about the Rose Bowl float and then show that image, it would have reinforced his point so strong, and I wouldn't have been distracted for the last 3 minutes. You see how you have to ask yourself, what's on the screen? And what am I going to be talking about while that's on the screen? And does it make sense? If it doesn't, don't put it up there. I would rather have you black out the screen and talk for 2 or 3 minutes and then bring the images back on than to give me something up there that's not related to what you're talking about. Because I'm going to drift. And so is everybody else in the audience, at least a significant percentage of people will. You got to ask yourself, how does this reinforce what I'm trying to say? Not just repeat what I'm trying to say. Reinforce. It's not just about repetition. Because repetition gets old after a while, too. I mean, am I really that dumb that, preacher, I got to read everything that you're saying word for word? You know what, preacher? Print it out, hand it to me at the door, and let me go home. If I can just read your sermon, I don't need to listen to you preach it, do I? I mean, just give me your notes, let me go. There's other things for me to do. And so you got to give them a reason to engage. You have to give them a reason to look at the screen and to listen to what you're saying, to reinforce your ideas. It's not just visual noise. And so you have to be constantly asking yourself, the background, the colors, the visuals, are they all there to reinforce what I'm talking about? Well, in addition to this whole concept of sensory overload and trying to get their attention and keep their attention and reinforcing your message, there are some things that you have to remember about PowerPoint before you get started down the PowerPoint road. And the first one is, it takes more time. Rick, how much time do you spend on your PowerPoint when you do a sermon?
Probably 5 hours.
Ray, would you agree with that? Statistically, from the people that I've asked, you can pretty much add 3 to 6 hours to your preparation, on average, to do it right. Okay? I can do it in 2 hours, and guess what? I can get them to turn their visual filters on in 30 seconds. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about thinking it through, doing it right is going to take you at least 3 to 6 hours. Now, if computers are not your thing, if you struggle with computer usage, figure more like 5 to 9 hours to do this right. The question you have to ask yourself is, can I afford it? Do I have an extra 6 to 7 hours a week to put my lessons on PowerPoint, and is the payoff large enough for the investment? Am I going to be more effective as a minister visiting members of my congregation for those 3 to 7 hours and be more effective in teaching them and helping them understand God's Word than spending that 7 hours locked in my inner sanctum office because I'm going to put together the best PowerPoint they've ever seen in their lives. Okay? You have to play that game, guys. It's a significant amount of time. When you start to talk about 6 to 7 hours, that's most of a work day. Now, I'm assuming, and I don't want to speak for these guys, but that's in addition to putting your lesson together, guys. This isn't just what it takes to do the whole thing. You've already spent how many hours putting together your outline for your lesson? Hopefully, you've invested at least 6 to 12 hours just putting your lesson together. And now on top of that, you need another 6 hours to put your visuals together. There are some ministry situations where you're just not going to be able to have that kind of time. And you have to know that going in. And if you cannot spend that time, turn it off. Preach. Talk to them. Relate to them. Use that time for ministry. You'll be far more effective as a preacher and as a minister if you use that time more wisely. Well, why does it take so long? Well, one of the reasons why is because it requires new skills. I mentioned this earlier. You've been trained, or those of you that are freshmen and sophomores, you will be trained in verbal communications. You'll have homiletics courses that will talk about how to present things, how to organize yourself. But you don't know how to do that visually, and you have to learn. It requires new skills like just dealing with a computer. You need to be competent with a computer for it to take 3 to 6 hours. What are you going to do if problems arise? What are you going to do if your computer dies? Do you know about making backups? Do you understand how to keep track of your files? If I had a nickel for every time somebody's come up to me and said, I saved this file somewhere, I have no idea where it is. Well, you know what? For somebody that uses a computer much at all, first you should know where you saved it. Second of all, you should know how to at least do a search to find it. But I have guys all the time that say, it's in here somewhere. I have no idea where it is. And I sit down and 30 seconds later, I found it because I searched for part of the name or did something. But they've got no clue. Well, all of that stuff takes more time. It's going to add to your headache as far as doing it. You also have to understand visual communications. How do you find images that relate to what you're saying? Are you a visual thinker? Do you think visually? I'll tell you what, PowerPoint is a more effective tool for visual learners than auditory learners. And what I mean by that is I tend to be a visual learner. And I tend to use PowerPoint more effectively than most auditory learners do because I'm thinking visually. When I'm learning something, I'm making images in my head. And so I know what kind of images I want to go find that will reinforce what I'm trying to say because I'm already playing that little dance in my head. I already know kind of what kind of visuals I want to use to leverage this particular concept. If you don't think that way, this is a much more difficult tool for you to use. And you need to have some understanding of graphic design. Now, I'm not saying that everybody needs to learn to become a graphic designer, but you have to understand color and layout and balance. You have to at least know how to do some basic image manipulation. You have to understand issues like typefaces and readability. And, does that little font that looks like somebody scratched it out, like a little kid scratched it out, is that really a good title font for, Be Saved Today is your sermon title? Probably not. Okay? But you've got to understand how those things function and how they work. So how do you do that? Well, get professional help. First, psychological, because you're even thinking of doing this. But secondly, tap into the talents of your congregation. Look for people in your congregation that can help you with this. We kind of always talk about trying to get more of our membership involved in things? Well, here's a good example. You may have teenagers or younger people that do the graphic stuff all the time. They like playing with graphic stuff. They're visual thinkers. I actually heard of one congregation that had a team, a committee of 3 people that did the PowerPoints for the preacher. And he got them his outline 2 weeks ahead of time. They spent a week putting the visuals together. Then they met with the preacher to go over the visuals and go over what everything looked like and why they made the choices they did, and got his input, made changes. He rehearsed it on Saturday with their new PowerPoint so that he knew what images were coming up, what transitions were happening, that kind of thing, and moving along. And he had 3 more people in the congregation that were involved, that maybe wouldn't have been involved in some other kind of work. Now, that can be cumbersome. I'm not going to lie. I think that could be complicated at times. You know what you're trying to say your way. But is it worth trying to get members involved in order to give up some of that to be more effective? If they really do have those communication skills, they might be better at it than you are. Even though you're the guy that's got to present it and stuff, they may bring something to the table that you hadn't thought of before. And if you can manage the time, which is, a biggie, then get more people involved. Look for people in your congregation that can help. The other thing to remember is that it's just may not be suitable for every lesson. And, I preached a lesson here at Bear Valley probably a month and a half ago. And I didn't use PowerPoint. And I must have had 15 people come up to me afterwards and like, you didn't use PowerPoint? You're the PowerPoint guy. And I said, that's exactly why I didn't use PowerPoint today. Because you need to understand that it's not just about always doing PowerPoint. It's not always effective. It's not always suitable. Some conceptual ideas visually represent justification. Visually represent personal conviction. Now, if you can find ways to do those kinds of things, it can make it very, very powerful. But if you just grasp at straws for images to support those kinds of concepts, guess what? The visuals don't match what you're saying, the filters go on, you've lost. So it might be better just to preach on justification, preach on personal conviction, those things that are hard to represent visually. And that's the challenge. Can I represent what I'm talking about visually? Can I pull this off? Can it reinforce what I'm saying to the point where I can leave something in their mind when they walk out of here, that when they see that cat, they're immediately going to remember X. You follow? That's really what it's about, is tying it all together. Well, let's talk about some annoying things. And this is not my list, okay? This list was developed by a group of business professionals who are routinely subjected to PowerPoint presentations. So, this isn't me just saying these are the most annoying things. This is what people who have to watch PowerPoint say are the most annoying things about bad PowerPoint presentations.
This is an actual study.
This is an actual study. 60.4% said the speaker reads the slides to us. Do you think we're dumb? I can read. He doesn't have to read it to me. Give it to me in a handout, let me go home. I don't need to be in this meeting if all he's going to do is read what's on the slide. You need to add to whatever the visuals are. If you don't do that, then guess what? The information is on the screen. The screen becomes relevant. You become irrelevant. If you're not adding anything to the discussion that isn't already on the screen, you're the one that becomes irrelevant. 50.9% said the text was too small and could not be read. Anybody ever been to a PowerPoint presentation where they put so much stuff on the screen and it's just so small you really couldn't read it very effectively? You spend the whole time trying to figure out what they're talking about. It gets old very fast. 47.8% said that the speaker used full sentences on screen instead of bullet points. You don't have to write out every word of a sentence. If your point is be baptized, you don't have to say, and it's important for you to be baptized, and put all of that on the slide. Just put be baptized. You can talk about the rest. You don't have to use full sentences. Give people snippets of information. Supplement it with what you say to keep them engaged, to keep them marrying the visual with your audio. 37.1% said the slides were hard to see because of poor color choice. Now, it's funny, because on screen that really doesn't look too bad. Does anybody have a hard time reading that?
Harder than the white.
Harder than the white. There are some colors, especially reds and blues, that if you put them next to each other or on top of each other, they vibrate so badly around the edges, your eye actually sees it as vibration. It makes it very hard to read. On computer screens especially, if you've seen some websites that are that really bright blue against a darker red, it almost starts to do this dimensional thing, where it looks like one is way forward and one's way back. The other thing is when you put complementary colors next to each other, red and green, for example, Christmas red and Christmas green, when you put green words on top of a red background, the edges start to blur together, and it's called complementary vibration. Your eye is trying to mix the colors, and it just kind of hurts your eyes. And so you have to be careful of the colors that you pick. We'll talk more about color in a little bit, but it's important that you pick colors specifically and consciously, not just randomly. 45.5% said moving or flying text and graphics was just flat annoying. And I agree with that. We'll talk about transitions and how to bring information onto a slide and what you should do and what you shouldn't do. One of my favorites, and I really felt sorry for this guy. Have you ever seen the typewriter kind of transition where the words come in one letter at a time? Well, he had an entire quote from Scripture. Wasn't a really long one, but he chose that as his transition. He was finished talking about the quote before it was even finished coming onto the screen, and guess what? You can't move on. When PowerPoint is still trying to build the slide, you can hit the next button all you want. It didn't go into the next slide because it's trying to finish drawing the first one. So he literally had to wait for all these letters to finish coming on the screen because he didn't mean to say anything more than just what the quote said and move on. Well, his transition took like 2.5 minutes. We'll talk about actually testing your PowerPoint before you give it as well, which would be an important aspect. But really, guys, and I'll tell you, Microsoft has been horrible, horrible, horrible about giving you things that move and spin and do things that should never have been created and should never have been a temptation for you. 90% of the transitions and the text animations are absolutely useless. Do not use them. They're distractions. And so, unfortunately, Microsoft thinks it's really cool to give you 800 to choose from. And there are people who think they have to use all 800 in a PowerPoint presentation. It gets old very fast. 22% said too many different backgrounds. It just gets confusing when the background is changing from slide to slide to slide to slide. You've got no idea where we are in the outline, don't know what point you're making or what it's related to. And so the idea here is to keep some background consistency. There's one preacher here that will remain nameless who I'd love to give a hard time about this particular one too, because he flat out does not agree that too many backgrounds is a problem. And I finally said, why do you not agree that too many? And he said, because I like it. And that's, of course, why you're up there, right? Is you make your PowerPoint for you. and what you like, right? I mean, isn't that? You see how quickly this becomes a toy. It becomes something to play with. I like this cool fly-in spinning transition. I just think it's neat. It has absolutely no relevance to my message. I don't care if it distracts anybody. I think it's cool. So guess what? You're going to see it every time I put a slide up. You're missing the point. How does it reinforce what I'm trying to say? 22% said the graphics did not fit the topic of the slide. Again, we're back to this idea that the visuals have to support what you're saying. They have to integrate. They have to make sense. If they don't, you're losing your audience. They're trying to make that connection. They're going to keep trying to make that connection, whether they're paying attention to you or not. And 12.6% said too many different fonts were used. And that becomes a serious problem as well. Questions about this first section? Statements, comments? Okay, we're going to take a break and pick this up with part 2 after the break. We're going to start talking about distractions.
Got some water in your face.
No.
But see, that was like, that's a good point, because actually the guy, his name is he's from Pearland, Texas. He's actually a very good speaker. The reason I use him is because he's big.
He will lose quickly. Oh, he has a paper. We're keeping the paper. I don't know where mine is. Oh,
He uses that typewriter point with machine gun sound.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so annoying.
Well, I do have.
and that
I've had these discussions.
what? You have a time. I thought him what? I said you can handle those computers.
I'm open to discussion. I think there may
Yeah,
be
it's times two. Yeah, it's just.
Well, he's very on right now because they haven't turned off, but I can set it up. Because if I can, I don't know what. Before you think.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
What are you doing?
Chinese.
I think
We're trying to find the term.
black.
We looked for talking.
They can't.
I hit him.
You hear me?
They're in the freezer.
Here, they in the break room.
There's visual illustration.
No, we didn't
And
see.
then you go to a
No,
black
they're in
screen.
the
They have to be looking.
Okay.
bathroom.
Yeah.
Here you go.
When we finish, don't go before me. Okay.
Yep.
Okay, you know how to get your library, right?
Yep.
Everyone.
Well, most people have this. In fact, I didn't. In fact, I
There
funny
is
this collector mentioned this. Just put talk about anything. He said, "Oh, that's a good idea. I'm gonna do that. Oh, that's
So
good."
that first program.
Oh, no, no, I'm not
whole
gonna do
thing in
that.
Chinese.
Why not? They won't get it. Or it is.
I just always engage the senses.
Show me how to
Engage better.
The one we did today is.
Their mind is one sense.
That's right, that's right. It's so you literally can't put something on the screen and speak while they look at it. So you either have to give plenty of time to go over it and then draw their attention back to you.
What does that say?
Or he steps in the middle of the screen, which is really kind of blinding.
That's
Manual.
Do you have a ceiling mount or a floor?
We both got you. Okay. Ours in the hearing is
Yeah, First Timothy.
16 and 20 or 40.
Yeah, I already took much.
Here's your outline.
Yeah.
This
Of course, they're going to about this size.
chapter.
Right now. You need to go back and watch.
Okay, so we're get started here again. What I want to talk about now in this second part is actually some distractions. Part 2 is about major distractions. What things distract people and cause them to have the filters go on, typically. Now, there's no way I can cover all of them. And different people will have different filters. We were just talking during the break. It's not unusual for you to get members of your congregation to say, I really loved your PowerPoint, that was really awesome. And someone else to say, I thought that was the biggest distraction and I got no clue what you're talking about. Now you want to minimize that as much as you can, obviously. But it's not necessarily going to resonate with everybody. But guess what? When you speak, it doesn't either. And if you really believe that every time you get up and speak that every member of your congregation is absolutely riveted and is understanding everything and is just 100% tuned in, this probably isn't the line of work for you. Because you're gonna be very disappointed very quickly to find that a significant percentage of your congregation isn't paying attention most of the time, even when you are doing good things. So we want to minimize the things that can cause distractions. So what are the major distractions? I'm going to try to deal with them in categories as much as I can. And the first one is working with text. You're dealing with words on screen. So what do you have to do to make sure that those messages are coming across well? Well, the first one is limit the amount. Simply limit the amount of text that you put on any given screen at a time. Now, the other thing we were talking about during break is you have to understand that this tool was not built for preaching. PowerPoint is not a preacher tool. We're using it for that, but it was designed for engineers and business salespeople to communicate statistical analyses about their business. And so bullet points and that kind of thing are something that this was designed for, but not in a preaching environment. And so when you go online and you read some things about how to do good PowerPoint, they're typically talking about how to do good business presentations. I have read suggestions that state very strongly that you should never have more than 8 words on a single slide, ever. Never more than 8 at a time. Now, I understand the concept, and I agree with it to a certain extent. But bottom line is, when you're trying to communicate a passage, you can't chop it into 8-word chunks. It just doesn't work. So you need to strive for the least amount of text on the screen as necessary to make your point. How much do I have to show? What can I do to minimize how much text I'm putting on the screen? Here's an example. That's very interesting. It's too much. You put somebody in the back of the congregation, even though I've highlighted some things in yellow, it's just too much text. I need to break this down into smaller chunks so that I can deal with sections of it at a time. It's too much to read, and what's the problem? Well, I want them to focus on the 2 sections. One is, each of you be baptized, and the other one is, there were added about 3,000 souls. Those are really the 2 things I want them to focus on. What are they focusing on?
I can't read it.
Okay? So there's at least some members going, I got no clue what that says. Is that first word therefore? And what verse is it? I can't even see where it is. If they can read it, they may be reading, for the promises for you and your children who are far off. I wonder who the far off people are. And the promises for you and your children, does that mean my children? I mean, you're talking about each of you be baptized, and there were 3,000 added, and they've picked a different part of your pericope to think about because you've given them that opportunity. You're letting them look at any part of this they want to, and guess what? They will. Just because you want them to focus on a particular part of it doesn't mean they're going to. So you have to give them ways. Now, I still don't think this is a viable solution, but one of the things you can do is a visual trick like this, and I don't have any understanding why this is so far behind. But circle it. Do something to make them focus on just the text that you're dealing with. If you really feel like you have to put this much text on the screen, I don't think you do, but if you really feel like you have to, do something to highlight it. Bold the word. Put boxes around them. Do something to minimize the rest of the text so that your audience will focus on what you want them to focus on in the pericope. But bottom line is, reduce, reduce, reduce. Figure out ways to put fewer words on the screen. And most of the time you can figure out how to do that. Now, I talked to one preacher who said, well, you realize that means I'm going to have like twice as many slides. So? Well, that's a lot more work. So? I mean, do you want to be effective or do you want to save time? I mean, bottom line is I could put the entire New Testament on one slide. It's not going to do any good. It's not going to help. So you're either going to have to invest more time and, oh my goodness, actually make more slides, or turn it off. Do it as a handout. Do something, but dumping it on one slide because you don't want to make it into 3 slides is a silly excuse, okay? Yes?
Do you have a suggestion for a minimum font size?
No. And I'll tell you why when we get there. There are people that will say, you know, in this environment, in this classroom, because of the brightness of the projectors, Dan Owen will tell us you can't be less than like a 48. Well, I don't think that's necessarily true, but the reason I don't give a specification is because it completely depends on your building. If your projectors are real bright and you've got a big screen area where you're projecting a large image, you can get away with smaller ones. If you're projecting to a little tiny square on a side wall and your projector isn't very bright, well, you're going to have to go a lot bigger. It's really going to depend on the environment you're in. Now, what does that tell you if you're traveling? You're rolling the dice, folks. When you travel and you're betting the farm that their PowerPoint is going to act like your PowerPoint projector and that their visual presentation is going to be just like your congregation back home, you're taking a big risk. And I have seen it really burn guys who think they're going to get somewhere and it's going to be just like at home. Well, guess what? It isn't. And we'll talk about that more later on. You're going to have to do your homework on that kind of stuff when you're traveling to a different congregation and you want to use these tools. Here's another example. This was on and I need to tell you that the examples that I'm showing you are from real PowerPoint presentations. I didn't make many of these slides. I'll tell you the ones that I made. I didn't try to make them wrong to give you an example. I actually asked guys if I could borrow their PowerPoints long enough to copy the bad slides out of, so that I could show them. What's wrong with this slide? Okay, we know that it's got too much text on it, but what else is really wrong with it?
Color.
Okay, color could be a real problem for some folks. I don't think it's horrible, but it's not great. Right.
I also think there's too many. It's bold and underlined and all kinds.
So there's too many font styles.
It runs together.
There's also, everything has the same visual weight. Now, understand what I mean by that. They have tried to separate things from the text by making some things bold and some things underlined. But if you squint, and this is a technique, you guys think I'm out of my mind. This works. I want you to look at the screen and I want you to intentionally blur your eyes a little bit. What stands out?
The white.
But, I mean, to any significant degree, it just kind of all blurs together, doesn't it? There's not one thing that jumps off the screen. What do you want them to focus on this screen? Well, everything has the same visual weight. The white helped, but not enough. The font is the same size as the yellow or the green or whatever color that is. It doesn't stand out anymore except for the color. And when you squint your eyes, it just kind of all blurs together into one big blob, doesn't it? Learn to look at your screen with your eyes out of focus. What stands out? If the answer is nothing, redesign the slide. Seriously. You want one thing, maybe two. I get myself in trouble. My guess is one thing. To really be the central focus of each slide that you present. So, what is that one thing? And try to do that as often as you can. Now, it's not always possible. I recognize that. But those are things that you strive for. Here's another one. I like this one. So much text on the screen that they had to stretch this poor guy so he looks like a stick. And we're going to talk about distorting people later. This breaks so many rules visually. I can't tell you how fast the filters are going on in the audience when people see this. But here's an example of the text is too long. Look at the second bullet point. The first test of Abraham's faith was to give up what was dear to him and rely on God. Do you need all of that as the bullet point? Couldn't you shorten that to Abraham's first test? Or, give up self. Rely on God. Something. You don't have to have it be that giant, long, full sentence in order to get your point across. And then maybe you can give this guy, let him gain some weight again. Because he's just too thin. It's just not right. Okay, what's the problem with this one? What's the problem with this one? It seems pretty clean. Not a lot of different font styles. Okay, what I mean when I say I love you. First, no other woman. And I'm now going to talk for a minute and a half about no other woman. What are you doing?
Reading the rest.
You're already at be your servant. I'm still on no other woman. You're on be your servant. I don't know if I want to be your servant. You're already forming argumentation against what I'm going to say long before I even get there. The problem with this isn't necessarily the layout so much as it's too much information at once. Now, I would suggest that you could break this down into 8 or 9 different slides and add visuals to help. No other woman. Use an image of that. And I mean, it wouldn't have to be anything racy, but do something to visually reinforce that idea. Make it a singular slide. The idea here is, again, and I've said this before, so repetition does work. You want to let them focus on the one thing that you're talking about right now. I want to have a personal conversation with you. I want your eye contact. I want you to be understanding what I'm talking about. I don't want you drifting. And when I give you a list of 12 things, guess what? I'm on number 3. You're on number 8. So don't give them number 8. Give it to them in chunks, one at a time, where you can keep their attention on the one point that you're talking about. Because I'm going to read all 12 of these long before you're ever finished with all 12. Does that make sense? So bring lists especially in one item at a time. Make sure that you keep them on you. Font-wise and everything, this isn't so bad. It's probably hard to read from the back of an auditorium, so I still think there's too much text, but at least it's somewhat clean. Here's an example of what I mean, okay? This was actually a sermon that I did on walk in a worthy manner. What is the fruit you are bearing? What's the fruit you're bearing here at Bear Valley? Now, I can talk for the next 10 minutes about this point. Where are you going to drift to? I've given you nothing to drift to. Now you may get tired of what I'm talking about and may pick up the bulletin, but at least I'm not fueling the fire visually. And once I'm finished talking about here at Bear Valley, in your family, what is the fruit that you're bearing here in your family? Now, I can leave here at Bear Valley on the screen. Why? Because I've already dealt with it. You're pretty much going to exhaust their adventure with that topic by what you say.
What another way that you could do that is once you bring in your family, that you're here at Bear Valley can go back to being the goldenrod
Sure.
and yellow color.
Right,
So that
drop it back.
becomes boring. Now
Yep.
we'll pay attention to
Minimize it, screen it back, make it dimmer. There's a lot of techniques you could use so that it doesn't have as much emphasis as in your family, and that's a great technique. Because right now I want you to concentrate on in your family. What is the fruit you're bearing in your family? That's what I want to talk about. That's what I want you thinking about. So I want to isolate it. So you have to be thinking about what I'm talking about. At your workplace, and so on. You get the idea. In your recreation. Each time I bring a new one in, I'm talking about one thing at a time. But if I put all of these up at the very beginning, here at Bear Valley, in your family, well, while I'm talking about here at Bear Valley, you're thinking, how am I bearing fruit in my workplace? Man, I guess maybe I'm not doing that. These little conversations that you have in your own head are what are distractions from what the preacher's talking about. And I know that I'm not the only one that does it, so don't try to make me think that I'm crazy. Here's an example of a list. This isn't too bad, but this borderlines on too much. Now, this was a summary statement. This was a summary slide. And this is one of mine, and I will admit that it's a little heavy. But these were the 5 points of my sermon. When I had concluded, when I was trying to bring it all back together, these were the 5 points that I had dealt with. So again, the reason I can show them all at once is because I've already dealt with them. I'm just recapping real quickly. And this slide isn't going to be up long enough for them to really drift and say, conducting ourselves in fear, I wonder what that's going to be about. I've already dealt with it. So when you get to your conclusion, you can get away with a little bit more text on the screen as long as you're summarizing something that you've already said. Because at that point, it's just review.
Would it be so bad to bring them in individually?
No, but recognize that takes time.
Half a second.
Yeah. As long as you don't use the typewriter machine gun transition, you can. And I would suggest that. So what have we talked about today? We prepare our minds for actions by keeping sober. Hit the button. Fixing our hope completely on the Lord's return and on heaven. Hit the button. Conforming ourselves to holiness. Bring them in one at a time would be fine. Yes?
Are there any negatives to having the previous point fade to, I use white text, to have it fade to a dimmer, it dims when I go to the next text?
No. Again, it depends on how much visual clutter there is on the screen when you're done. Whatever you can do to bring the point that you're talking about more to the forefront, again, blur your eyes. What you're going to notice when you do that is those others are going to drop away. When you blur your eyes, they're going to kind of fade away, and that one that you're talking about tends to stand out. That's what you want. And as long as you're accomplishing that, you're helping them stay focused on the one point that you're trying to make. So, limit the amount of text whenever possible. Number 2, limit the number of fonts that you use. Guys, I know you can buy these CDs that are 1,000 fonts for $9.95, and they have everything under the sun. You can make things look like clown lettering and that kind of stuff. General rule of thumb, pick 2 fonts, a title font and a text font for your entire presentation, and stick with that whenever possible. Here's some examples of, it's like, oh my, you've got different font styles. The Roman numeral for the outline is one font size and color. The Y marriage is another. The first box is a third one. The Malachi 2 is bold and a different color and got a very strange outline around it. Then they're trying to make Covenant stand out, so it's a 4th typeface. And again, they picked people that they squished. It just isn't right to squish people. Never, ever squish people, okay? But it's just too many different fonts going on. Try to keep it simpler. Here's another one. There's like 5 different typefaces going on this one slide. It's too much. It doesn't help. Now, I guess they thought the wedding vows versus wedding intentions looked like a wedding invitation-y kind of font, so that's great. But then they switched to something else when it gets to when Christians marry, and then it gets to promises, not intentions, a covenant. Blur your eyes at this slide. What stands out?
Nothing. It blends together.
Really nothing, does it? You might have a shot at promises, not intentions, a covenant. Huh? What on earth does that mean? Promises, not intentions, a covenant. Somehow you got to break this up, and this time they squished people vertically instead of horizontally to make it fit. We've looked at this slide already. As far as fonts go, this slide really isn't bad. It's clean. It presents things in a meaningful way. I think there's too much text, but at least they didn't jump all over the place font-wise. I mean, they're dealing basically, it looks like, with one typeface. They bolded the title and didn't bold the rest of it, and it makes it simple. I'm not distracted by any of the typeface information on this slide. Here's another one. Again, pretty simple. You're not dealing with a lot of different typefaces. You're dealing with basically one for the title, one for the body copy, and the title's a little bit more bold. Blur your eyes at this slide. What do you see?
Strong second place.
Strong second place. What point do I want to make about this slide? Strong second place. Now, I realize out of context you don't know what that means, but that's what this slide is talking about. That's what I want you to walk away with, is this concept of being in a strong second place position.
That's a pretty good one.
So,
That's a pretty good slide.
yeah, thanks. This is one of mine from...
It's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I really like that one too.
Let's see what we have to deal with. Okay, so limit the amount, limit the number of fonts used. Spelling and grammar, guys, is a killer. It's a killer on your blogs. It's a killer in your PowerPoints. When you put typos out there, people gravitate toward typos and grammar. You may not have picked up on the grammar when you wrote it, but bottom line is you've got English people, English teachers out there that can't get past the fact that that word is misspelled. I know people that literally want to stand up in the middle of your sermon and say, change it, it's spelled wrong. It drives them that crazy that they just want to fix it, like right now. And the only thing they're thinking about while you're preaching your wonderful point that this slide is about is that he misspelled that word. And I'm telling you, folks, for some people, it is a major distraction. They cannot get past it. And it's so simple to avoid. Just use spell checker. Just make sure that your words are spelled correct. Do some proofreading. The other thing with working with text that's important is size and color. This is another one where things can fall apart really, really quickly. And if you're not careful, people are just not going to be able to follow what you're talking about and what it says. What does that say underneath that picture of the orange tree?
There's something red in Matthew 25.
Now, on my screen, it is perfectly readable. What's your problem?
That's not yours.
Exactly. Thank you, Brett. That's not your computer screen. Folks, you got to recognize the colors on your computer screen when you're this far away from it, everything looks great. When you project, it disappears. There's a rule of thumb, and it's really kind of funny. I need to tell you this story. This is a rabbit chase, but it's kind of funny. Red, the color red, has the lowest distance transmission of any color. Now, what do I mean by that? It travels through the air the least distance of any other color. Red is not a good color to project any length of space. And what happens is we think about red from print days, right? When you want to make something stand out on a white piece of paper, what do? You make it red. Words of Jesus in your print Bible, what did they do? Made them red. Why? So that they would jump off the page. Guess what? You take that same thing and apply it to PowerPoint, and everything that you turn red disappears. I actually worked for a company where our sales manager had a major presentation at a major event that I happened to attend. And I was a marketing guy, and I asked him to let me review his PowerPoint, and I got the, I've been doing PowerPoint for years, you can't tell me anything I don't already know kind of thing. Okay, fine. Every slide, his keyword was red. Against a dark background, like this. His keyword in every slide wasn't visible past the third row of the auditorium. It wasn't there. It just wasn't on screen. And so every word that he was trying to push had absolutely no visual connection at all. It was gone. And I've seen the same thing happen with preachers. They want to make a word in a verse pop, so they make it red. Well, on my computer screen, it looks pretty good. It jumps out pretty well. But by the time you transmit it any distance across an auditorium, it just disappears. It doesn't hold up. Now, what do you see in the text underneath the picture? Matthew 25:23. Why? Somebody said it. What was it? Contrast. You have to work for contrast. Now, you can take that too far, but always work for contrast. If you've got a dark background, you need to use lighter colors for your type. If you use a light background, you need to use darker colors for your type. Here are a couple of examples. These may not vibrate as badly on this screen as they do in some environments. What's the word under color can make a big difference? Color can make a big what? Difference. Can you guys see that okay? Does everybody see that all right? How many can read it with absolutely no problem at all?
Read it.
About half.
It's possible.
Look, now, everybody turn around and look at the monitor in the back of the room. Is there a difference? Color reacts differently when it's being transmitted from a projector environment or being displayed on a screen, that kind of thing. So you got to recognize that this can happen. Now, a little statistic. Statistics tell us that 4 out of 6 men have some level of red and green color blindness. Did y'all know that? 4 out of 6. So I don't know what that amounts to, about 60% or so of all men have some level of red and green color blindness. Now, it doesn't mean that they can't see yellow and or red and green. It means they have some level. Has everybody ever taken a color blindness test? The little circles that have all the colors in it with the little numbers? I am completely convinced that there are no numbers in at least half of those circles. It is a psychological test to see if they can drive me crazy. No. Because they tell me that it says 28 and it is not there. So, you have to take that into consideration as well. You may not have any red and green color blindness, but you know what? From here, I cannot see that word. Almost at all. Now, it looks fine on my computer screen, and it looks fine back there. But in this kind of an environment, it's almost impossible for me to see it. You know what else I have a real hard time with? When you start moving a red laser pointer around, I got no clue where you are. If you're on a light-colored background, I can't follow that little red dot if my life depended on it. Now, in an environment like this, where it's really dark, I can spot it. But in other environments, you got no dot there. You're just waving your hand around. So recognize that there are other people that are in the same boat I'm in. Interesting that I was a graphic designer for 12 years and I have some red and green color blindness. We'll talk about how that
So you
worked
are
out.
fully convinced for that?
Huh?
You are convinced that if you are, you have color blind?
I do. I am red and green colorblind. Now, not 100%. Don't ask me what the color of the stoplight is on the top. I know that it's red. You have people do that. What color? You know, they're real quick. What color is this? Well, guess what? It's red. Okay, I know. But notice the difference. okay, here we've got a potential problem. Even if it's not a problem for everybody, potentially it's a problem for a significant percentage of the audience. What if we simply just do that? Isn't that easier? It's simpler. Now, it looks better even on the monitor in the back, but up here, I have no problem reading that. And nobody does. Because, again, you're working for contrast. And don't try to get fancy with your color choices. Understand that you want to try to minimize problems for everybody.
I think also to add on top of that is the age of the person in the audience. An older person's not going to be able to see.
Are you suggesting that I'm old?
That was not my point, but that's definitely true.
So what happens when you go the other way? When the background is a light color and you choose colors to lay onto a lighter colored background? Now that really doesn't look too bad on screen. Look at it in the monitor in the back. It's harder to read back there than it is up here, isn't it?
What's going on there?
Well, it's the way different environments, different projectors, different monitors display color. And I'm glad we have both in here to show you, because this is a great example of what happens. I'm in my office with my monitor or my laptop. Everything looks wonderful. I never bother to go shine it on through the projector in the auditorium until Sunday morning when I'm preaching, and half of my words look unreadable because you never did the test. You need to test on the equipment that you're going to actually present on. I mean, take the time to run through your sermon. I won't say that because that could be not true. I have never consciously preached a PowerPoint sermon that I did not run through the entire thing out loud with the equipment that I was going to use. Okay? Now, if I'm traveling, what does that mean? If I'm going to preach in Golden, I'm going to ask Rick if I can do it during Bible class time, or if I can get there earlier in the morning and somebody can fire it up for me, or if I'm traveling out of state, maybe Saturday night, hey, could you run me down to the building for 25 minutes, let me run through my lesson. Let's make sure all the fonts are working, make sure everything's working with your equipment. I do not want surprises Sunday morning. And, you know, guys, I have had so many guys come here to preach, and they hand me a little thumb drive and say, here's my sermon. It's like, okay, well, we'll go. I mean, you're starting in 2 minutes. Yeah, it'll be fine. All the fonts are wrong. They didn't include some of their pictures. They're using PowerPoint 1984, and we're on PowerPoint 2008, and the files aren't compatible. But they've been saving money by not upgrading at their place for the last 28,000 years. Things can happen, okay? So you need to make sure that you can test. But look at the differences between these. Now, if I just change the color, now look at the difference between the monitor and the projector. They're almost the same. And again, it's because I was striving more for contrast, and it makes it easier to read. I don't have to deal with those color issues. So, I don't have time here to teach you color theory for the rest of the time that we're in school. But understand that the colors you choose makes a difference. How you present colors side by side can have a very dramatic impact on what ends up on your screen. And the only way you're going to know if it works or not is going to be projected in your auditorium, under your lighting conditions, with your equipment. And so, check it out.
Would you say that the difference is, generally speaking, between a projector and your laptop, or are different projectors different?
Projectors tend to be very similar. I have seen situations where from projector to projector they can be different if they've got settings adjusted. But the biggest difference is from your monitor to a projector. Typically, everything looks great on your monitor. You're 24 inches away from it. You know, it really, you're just not going to have the struggles that you have. But when you start projecting it, especially over distance, I mean, here we're spanning, 15 feet? You know, in our auditorium upstairs, we're spanning 70 feet. There's a big difference. Now, we have special lenses to help us do that, but color changes when you throw it 70 feet, and you need to make sure that you understand that. And contrast is always helpful. Okay? Questions about that? So, when working with text, we talk about limiting the amount, limiting the number of fonts, spelling and grammar, size and color. Biggest point I can make is make it easy to read. Just strive for readability. If you think it's important enough to put it on the slide, make sure they can read it. And test it. Check it. Now, I have some different rules for working with Bible text. And it's because it is something that we end up doing all the time. And I realize that sometimes you have to put more text on the screen than you want to. But when you're dealing with the Bible text in your lesson, and these are rules that tend to be pretty consistent. First of all, don't show off. Your job as the preacher is not to prove to the congregation that you have memorized more scripture than they have. And you know what, guys? I have been in that situation more than once where my impression was the preacher was just trying to show us that he has memorized a ton of stuff. And guess what? You haven't. 99. That doesn't help. I mean, you may have memorized a boatload of stuff, but it's not going to help me learn it. So don't show off. Show the words on the screen. I mean, be willing to present the text that you're talking about on the screen if you can. Reinforce it. Break it down. A lot of times, pericopes are too long to show in one big chunk. You have to strive to break it down, give it to them in smaller pieces so that they can absorb it and so that it remains readable. And again, make it readable. That's the deal. Here's an example of a slide. And I want you to imagine for a moment that you're in a congregation and a child in the pew next to you disrupts you, and you're distracted for 2 or 3 minutes from the sermon, and you look up and this is the slide. And the preacher is in the middle of reciting all of these passages from memory. What's he talking about? Oh, come on. You don't know what Matthew 28, Mark 16, John 3, Acts 2, Acts 22, Romans 6, 1 Corinthians 12, Galatians 3, Colossians 2, Titus 3 are all about? Off the top of your head? Come on. Aren't you guys Christians? Now, after a few minutes, you can figure out that he's talking about baptism. Is there any visual cue that he's talking about baptism? And when he's in the middle of reciting Romans 6, 3 to 4, and he's not told you that he's reciting Romans 6, 3 to 4, where is he in this list? Is he half done? How quickly are you going to go, how much longer is he going to take with this one? Why 2 Bibles?
That's really bad.
Why 2 Bibles? And why does one look like it has like a fungus on it or something? And one has a red background and the other has a white background. One's got it looks like a blue ribbon. Is that a blue ribbon? Or no, I guess it's a red ribbon. Do you see how quickly you start to lose what on earth we're talking about here? The power is in the words. The power is in God's words. Just because you can recite them from memory doesn't mean it's helping the audience to understand them. Let them see the words whenever possible. Now that exact slide, I have actually broken down into about 5 slides. So instead of presenting, now I need to tell you that that is a real slide that you just saw, and it was on screen for almost 10 minutes because he's making all of his points regarding those passages. So you're looking at that one visual for almost half of the sermon. It got mind-numbing, okay? So what I did, just to prove a point, is I changed it. And I just wanted to break it down and start to show it in a different way. Matthew 28, 18 to 20. Now, even if I can recite it from memory, you can follow along with me. All authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Go therefore and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. And lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. Now, same situation, You're in the pew, a little kid's been screaming in your ear for the last 2 minutes. You've been distracted. You look up, what's my sermon about? What am I talking about? How do you know I'm talking about baptism? Okay, it says it in the top. Clue number 1, I've actually told you what I'm talking about. How else do you know that it's about baptism?
Picture.
Picture in the corner of someone being baptized. Clue number 2. How else do you know that I'm talking about baptism? I've highlighted that particular emphasis in my text. There's 3 visual cues on this one slide. Actually, there's a 4th one that's a little hard to see. The word baptism is actually screamed into the background. You can't see it up here as easy. You can kind of see it in the back. It's actually screamed into the background of this slide a little bit as well. So there's actually 4 ways that I'm reinforcing what I'm talking about by showing you this slide in comparison to 0 in the last one. And now I can go through each one. I can go through Mark 16, 15, and 16 and do the same thing. And he said to them, go into all the world and preach the gospel to all creation. He who has believed and has been baptized shall be saved. I can go to John 3. Unless one is born of water. Again, I can recite this whole thing. But you can follow along with me. You can stay where I am. And bottom line is I can then summarize it all by saying, look, the words of Jesus talked about baptism. Peter's sermon talked about baptism. The conversion of Saul deals with baptism. Paul wrote to the Romans about baptism. This is all the same information, guys, that was on that one slide. I've turned it into 4, and I've helped you stay with me. Do you see the difference? And I've helped those who got distracted or turned their filters on get back on task if they have a desire to. Because when they look up, what am I talking about? I'm talking about baptism. Now what am I talking about? And this thing's taking too long to switch over. Do you see the difference? I look up and see the biblical texts. Okay? Are they all biblical texts? Are some of these not biblical texts? I mean, there's 1,000 things that I can drift on with this, but when I go back to the same pieces of information, I'm talking about the same material, in one slide, you're going to stay with me, aren't you? Do you see that? I'm giving you a reason to stay with me. I'm giving you those visual connections so that you can understand where I'm coming from. And we can all stay on the same page. That's what I'm talking about with all of this, is give them, and I don't care if it takes 20 slides, truthfully. I think you start to run into problems when you have too many slides. That becomes a different problem. But use more slides. Let them focus. Give them some consideration. Keep visually organized so that even if they do drift for a minute, you can help get them back on task. So what are some of the major distractions working with images? We talked about working with text, talked about the biblical text, Bible texts. Let's talk for a little while about distractions working with images. These are biggies. These tend to really start to push the envelope. First is don't force the space. If you don't have room for a graphic on the screen, go put one in there. I've already shown you this slide. This poor guy has been mangled. Okay? Why do we want to show pictures of human beings? I mean, as human beings, why do we want to put pictures of other human beings on the screen, Larry? Since you're laughing.
I thought you was making a point. I mean, what's the main point we're getting out of seeing another human being? We know what a human being looks like.
But why do visuals of people, why do we relate to them more?
A lot of times we put ourselves in their situation.
Because we're people. What are the 2 most important things to show on a person visually?
Face.
Eyes and hands. When you look at a person, a picture of a person, your eyes will go to their eyes first, and then you'll go to their hands, if their hands are in the picture. So be conscious of that. Make a connection with this guy. You can't even see his face. Plus, I don't look like that. I mean, he's been stretched, and he's been deformed, and the poor guy is in a rack kind of thing. And so while you're talking about Abraham was called to leave his home, I'm like, what? Oh, now I get it. This guy is leaving his home. He's got his coat in his hand. I think that's a coat. But why has he got his coat in his hand if he's leaving his home? Didn't he get dressed before he left? And his tie's a little cockeyed, and his face is really skinny, and you're still preaching, but I'm not following you. You see that? Yeah, we looked at this one too. This is about marriage. At first, I mean, when you first glance at this, does it look like a couple getting married? Now, the bride's been cut in half. You only see half of her. It looks to me as if he's putting a ring on her finger, I think. And that's why they chose this image. But you have to really think about it, don't you? I mean, it's not readily apparent. Now, how about a visual like this? Come on.
Rain.
Does this make the point? God restores us through time spent in prayer. What's this person doing? Praying. Did you even have to think about that for a second? The visual immediately communicated it. Now, I need to put more on this slide, though. What do? How do I squeeze the image up to make room for it? You need to learn to create boxes to put things in. Notice how now I can drop this on top of this image. Pray without ceasing, 1 Thessalonians 5:17. But I don't destroy the integrity of the image. You can actually, it's even a little transparent right in through here. You can still see the hands behind the box. So it really keeps the integrity of the image. And what two things did I make sure I didn't cover up?
The eyes and the
The eyes and the hands. Eyes, never ever cover up a person's eyes. As human beings, it's the first thing we look at. As soon as you cover them up, we don't know where to look. And we start drifting all over the page. Always let people's eyes be, even in a situation like this person's eyes are closed. But didn't you go there? Wasn't that one of the first places you looked? Now, visually, it's a little dark up front here. Look at the back. Your eye goes to the hands first because they're a lighter color, right? They're brighter. And the fingers lead you directly to the eye. This person is praying. I'm not going to do that. I need to create a slide where that box, pray without ceasing, is right underneath the other line of text. Because it covers the hands and the eyes, and you can see the slide just instantly turns to mush. It makes no visual sense at all. And it's disturbing. We don't like it when people have their eyes covered. And so it doesn't work. So don't force the space. Don't squish the graphic in order to make room for everything. Something's got to go. Reduce the amount of text to make room for the image. Create multiple slides so that there's room for the image. But don't just squish everything to try to fit it all on the page. Okay? It just doesn't work. Next is be really, really careful with backgrounds. This is probably the biggest error that I see as backgrounds. We get out on Google Images and we find all kinds of cool stuff. Here's an example. This guy started preaching, and this was an image. Now this, by itself, this is pretty cool. You've got all these faces, and so you can actually relate to these people. The nice thing about this image is that there's something for everybody, for the most part. You've got a young man, you've got an older woman, you've got some ethnicity, you've got an older man. Everybody in the congregation can probably find somebody they relate to in this image, and so that's a good thing. And then as the preacher went on, he started to make his points. Mankind needed redemption and salvation. And it gets harder and harder to read. The text is too small, there's too much of it. Again, look at it in the back. I think it's even worse in the back than it is in the front. It gets to the point where you can't even see it because the background is so chaotic. There's so much going on that it's hard to lay type over that background and have both be readable. Plus, what's my biggest problem with the title on this one? Goes right across the main lady's eyes, doesn't it? The word "and," redemption and salvation covers hers. Mankind covers the older woman's eyes. It blocks the key things that we're trying to look at. And the very last bullet point covers the older man's eyes exactly. So, here's an interesting one. He was preaching in Romans 5 and brought his text in. Now, why do you use red?
Because he wanted to make it understand.
Why do you use red? Blood. I'm trying to reinforce my point of Jesus shed his blood. So blood's red. My text needs to be red. Look at it in the back. Again, it's brighter, but it almost hurts your eyes. It vibrates so bad. See, the background is fighting with the text that you're trying to get. The two don't work together. And so you're missing the entire point. You lose both. You lose the power of the background and the power of the text because they both fight with each other. Here's another example. This was one slide. It was all brought in at once, and then each component of the slide was talked about. But the background's too busy. There's just too much going on. Now, I just changed this a little bit to make one point. And all I did was darken the background. Is that easier to read? Blur your eyes now. You at least still see the text. If I go back one, blur your eyes now. What do you see? Mush, right? I mean, the whole thing just kind of turns to, you might still pick up he was, person, cross, but the rest of it just falls apart. But just by doing something as simple as making the background a little bit darker, I make the text a little bit more readable. Why? What's the word? Contrast. Work for contrast. Now, you can still see the background. You can still see that this is a crucifixion scene. It still works visually. It just isn't as distracting from the text. And so now the background works and the foreground works. Now, I need to say, on camera and in public, I still would never do this with the dotted borders and all of that stuff. This should be 4 different slides, and I'm actually going to show you how to redesign this slide later on when we get into some practical stuff. But you can see the problem, can you not, with the background? Backgrounds are a huge issue. Okay. Use the background to help visually. Let it be a part of the story. The photograph of the girl praying was as much a part of that slide message as the words were, wasn't it? It reinforced what it was saying. Here's another one. God restores us through fellowship. What's the image? Singing. There's some fellowship going on here. People worshiping together, sharing together. Now, there's only 5 words on that whole slide, but look at what it communicates. Now, I want to put a verse on this slide. So what's my choice? I could squish everything up, but I can also just drop a box in temporarily. Notice it's somewhat transparent, so you can still see through it in places, but I drop in Philemon 6, and I pray that the fellowship of your faith may become effective through the knowledge of every good thing which is in you for Christ's sake. What did I not cover up? His face. The one face that you can see in this image, which is the song leader, I didn't cover up. And so be conscious of those things. Now, here's what I've actually seen done before. Same slide. I want to bring the text in. Does that work? Look at the one in the back. You can't even read it. Now, up here with this projector, because these projectors are a little bit dimmer, it's not horrible, but it still doesn't work. I mean, I still can't read that very easily. I have to struggle. You need to make it easy for your audience. They don't want to work. They've been working all week long. They don't want to work for your message. So you got to make it easy for them to see it, to read it, to understand the connection that you're making. It's the same point that I made earlier with this slide about baptism. It just makes it simple for them to stay connected with the message. Nothing fancy going on. Look at what does this background do? It reinforces my topic over and over again. Whether they want to look at the words or they want to be drawn to this woman and this man in the water, they're still going to be thinking baptism the whole time I'm talking, which is what I want. I don't want them confused. I want them to stay focused. Here's another background that I think works. It's maybe a little bit busy, but it was a lesson about the internet and how that could be helpful. So what's the background? Well, a computer monitor. Reinforce what you're talking about. There's no subtitles on here that talk about technology, but do you think this was probably part of a technology presentation? Why? Because the background tells you that's what we were talking about. So again, you have those moments, and it's happened to all of us where you've gotten distracted while the preacher's preaching. Some little kid screams, you drop a songbook or whatever. You look back up. Are you confused about where they are? Or can you get back into the flow of his message because visually he's kept you connected? And that's what you want to strive to do, is keep visuals on the screen that don't confuse people. And it's hard to do, but try to look at each frame, each slide, fresh that way when you're building them. If I were distracted and I came back to this, would it make any sense? Or do I have to know where you've been for the last 2 or 3 minutes? There are ways to help reinforce that. Now, it's not always possible, but strive for that whenever you can. So, don't force the space. Be careful with backgrounds. The last one is use cartoon images really, really sparingly. Be really careful with cartoony images. This is an example of what I mean. This was the title slide of a sermon. A new heart for the new year. And they've got surgical instruments and guys doing open heart surgery.
That's going to be traumatic.
Wow.
It's just a little odd. I mean, I get the point that was being made, but with it all being this clip-arty, cartoony kind of presentation, it's just a little too bizarre when you start looking at it. It just looks cheap when you use clip art kinds of stuff. So be really, really, really careful with clip arty types of images. Also be very careful of things that move. They are the greatest distraction of all. Now, I need to say something that I think is really cool. I am now using the brand new version of PowerPoint on a Mac. It just came out. And they have disabled the ability for animated GIFs to work within PowerPoint, which is so cool, I can't tell. All of these things spin. And I don't know, I was having problems in the break with Windows running. We'll see if I can actually get this to function. Let's do this. I'm going to quit it for just a second. I actually have this slide on Windows, and it's bizarre. Let me see if I can get it started again. Because everything's moving. And the reason I show it to you is because they were all from real presentations. Now, if you've ever been subjected to a PowerPoint with something moving or spinning on the screen permanently, it's such a distraction you can't even know.
It's really annoying too.
Yeah, that too. Where is it? Spinning stuff. Figures. I had this all set up to work while I was. No, it's not gonna. Okay, we're not gonna waste time on it. Trust me, it all spins. And now I'm gonna. She's gonna give me focus. Okay. The little earth spins, the heart beats, the page on the Bible flips, the little red heart in the corner just sits there and spins ad nauseum. And when you and all of those things I took from somebody's PowerPoint file. Now they weren't all on one slide. But most of them were used in one sermon. And if you can imagine, and what I used to do, and I'll see if I can get it for the next class period because we're not going to finish all this time anyway. What I used to do is actually show this slide and have it running over there and then tell you to watch me and not take your eyes off of me. And in your peripheral vision, you got this going on the whole time. You can't help but keep looking back over there. And you're asking yourself, why is the heart spinning? And is it important that it's spinning? Could it just be beating? Or what? And do the pages of the Bible have to turn all the time? And how long before the next one turns? And it's kind of like the movie Cars. I think every third time it's going a little slower. You're just asking yourself, what is this? Why is this reinforcing the message? And guess what? The answer is, it isn't. So don't do it. And I think it's very cool that they disabled that feature on the Mac version. You can't do it anymore. Make them relevant. Working with images, you have to make them relevant. If it doesn't make sense, don't put it up there. I've already showed you this slide. Why, on a slide about baptism, are you showing Bibles? Okay, because you titled it the biblical texts. But what does that have to do with your point? Your point isn't about biblical texts. Your point is about baptism. And why does one have a white background and one looks like it's got a disease? What are these visuals communicating? How are they reinforcing what's being said? This is one of my all-time favorites. I love this one. It cracks me up every time I see it. This was a title slide. It's about conviction.
What?
Now this is the conversation I'm having in my head. Preacher is preaching this whole time, believe me. Who is this guy? Am I supposed to know who this guy is? Maybe he's a criminal. Maybe it's conviction, like he's supposed to be some famous guy that just got thrown in jail. I don't know who he is. I wonder if he's one of those stock guys that just ripped off some company and got thrown in jail. But then the guy next to him is jumping for joy. Did he just get out of jail? Is that and why is there a little white line all the way around him? And is it the same guy? I can't really tell. If it doesn't look like the same guy. But what does this have to do with conviction? And guess what? It wasn't about conviction as in incarceration at all. It was about conviction of the heart, being dedicated to something. How do these visuals have anything to do with being dedicated to something? I don't know. And here's a good example. Because you have a portrait shot of this guy, where does your eye keep going? You keep going back to his eyes. Who is this guy? I want to know who this guy is. And guess what? I never found out. The preacher never bothered to say who he was or why he was there. it was just a title slide and he needed to fill up some space. So let's just show some pictures of some people. It doesn't make sense. Here's another one of my favorites. Now, this one I will show you tomorrow if it kills me, because this heart spins the whole time. What kind of heart do you have? One that spins or one that's in an ambulance? Actually, I don't have either one. Mine's not spinning. And as far as I know, it's not, you know, as soon as I see it, what do you think of when you see the ambulance?
It's going to crash into the heart.
Well, first of all, it's going to crash in the heart, okay? I hadn't even thought about that. Now, this shows you just where I go, okay? And I realize I'm a little twisted. I'm picturing the little igloo cooler inside this ambulance with somebody's transplanted heart in it. Why else would he be showing me an ambulance and asking me what kind of heart do I have? They're speeding a heart transplant to somebody somewhere, and I see the little orange and white igloo cooler in there. What does this have to do with it? It makes no sense. And we're having some fun with these little mental conversations, but you all do it. You may not admit it, but you do it. You have these little conversations with yourself about what you're seeing and how it relates. And everybody in your audience is doing it, and it just kills your lesson. And if you can imagine this red thing spinning, and it's spinning about this fast the entire time. Still going. It's still spinning. It's like still spinning. And you want to jump up out of the pew and just say, stop it. It's giving me a headache. Okay? So, bless his heart, he was trying to communicate.
Soften his heart.
At least one person got it. Yeah. All right, transitions. Transitions are another area where you can have big distractions. And this is another area where Microsoft is in league with Satan and has given you 8,000 transitions that should never have been created because they are almost completely useless. And so you need to be really careful. But the trick here is to select one or two and stick with them throughout the entire presentation. Once you decide on one, stay with it. I was talking to Brett during the break. Why stick with the transition throughout your whole presentation?
So people know what's coming.
Exactly. When you use 4 different transitions in a row, what am I looking at the next time you bring up a new slide?
What's the next transition?
What's the next transition? I could care less what the words are. What are you doing with it? You just start to look for what's going on. So be real careful with transitions. You can really abuse them quickly. And I am doing that on this slide intentionally. How does this reinforce what I'm trying to say? Was there a reason for it to come in one letter at a time and bounce all over the screen? And, does that have anything to do with what I'm saying? Or are you just trying to make sure everybody can't sleep because they're nauseous? You got to ask yourself, why does this reinforce what I'm saying? If I'm talking about walk in a manner worthy, does each letter have to walk onto the screen? Not necessarily. So be real careful. People start looking at the transition and not the message. They want to know what's coming next. Bottom line is just don't do it. I know it's a temptation. I know it's a toy. Create one PowerPoint in your office where you play with every single transition. Get it out of your system. I had a friend when I was growing up that his dad caught him smoking, and to break him of the habit, he made him smoke an entire pack of cigarettes until he started throwing up. And the kid never touched cigarettes again. Transitions are the same way. Play with them until they make you nauseous and you won't worry about it anymore. Just try every single one in every conceivable way that you can think of, and you'll be done. And you can say, I now know what they all look like, and I'm good. I tend to use one or two. I tend to like fade. I like zoom fade. I don't really go too far beyond those, truthfully. In all of my PowerPoint presentations, I tend to stick with either fade or zoom fade, and I'm good with that. It doesn't distract at all from my message, and I don't have to worry about people wondering what machine gun sound is going to come out of the screen when I bring them on like a typewriter. The next area of major distractions, and we only have a couple of minutes left, is technical problems. Technical problems always exist. They will always exist. You need to be ready for them. And there are even times when you have done everything that you can to do all of the things that I'm going to suggest, and technical problems still reach up and bite you. It's just the way it is. But it's one of the reasons why you need to be confident with your equipment. You need to understand how computers work. You may have to troubleshoot last minute, so understand that. First is practice and rehearse. Like I said earlier, I don't ever remember consciously presenting a PowerPoint sermon that I didn't go through the entire thing at least once, verbally, out loud, with a remote in my hand, looking at my laptop screen, going through each slide. And you need to do that. Have a backup plan. Folks, if you don't get anything out of today except this, you better take this one with you. When you start to present things visually, the tendency is to be very dependent on the visuals to make your point. That's why you took the 9 hours to find the photo that really reinforces your point. And you're putting a lot of weight on that, and that's okay. But guess what? You arrive at the church building, you hit the power button on your computer, and it doesn't start. Now what? Service starts in 5 minutes, and your computer is just like Rover, he's dead all over. What are you going to do?
That happened to me when I was in Elkhart.
There you go. What are you going to do? You better have a plan. Because you're not going to be able to say to the eldership of the congregation that you're visiting, and you're there, by the way, to get support. Oh, by the way, you're going to have somebody else preach this morning, but PowerPoint's not working. Sit there, preach. So, I always have even another entire lesson, if I have to, folded up in my Bible, ready to go. Kind of my go-to sermon, if I have to, that I will preach if the technology fails me. Because you just got to have a plan. And this has happened more than once. Their projector died. The bulb blew out. There's 1,000 things that can go wrong. And you need to be ready for at least 999 of them. Be familiar with the equipment. You need to be familiar with your own equipment if it's at your congregation. Don't just leave it to a deacon. Don't just leave it to the guys that run the back audio to manage everything. And if there's a problem, you have to rely on them. Get familiar with your own equipment. If you're traveling, get familiar with theirs. I mean, ask them ahead of time. I want to use PowerPoint while I'm there. Do you have a projector? I know of 2 guys that were traveling. They went to a congregation and handed them a jump drive and said, "Here's my sermon." They were like, "What are we supposed to do with this?" It's like, "It's for your PowerPoint." Well, we don't have PowerPoint. What do you mean you don't have PowerPoint? We don't have PowerPoint. And the guys that were preaching just assumed that everybody on the planet has a projector. Guess what? They don't.
I called and said, "Do you project your sermon?" He said, "Sure do." PowerPoint? Yep, great. I'll bring my Mac pigtail. I get there, he says, "Oh, I wish I'd known you were going to project." I said, "I called you and asked you." He said, "Yeah, and I do. But whenever I do, we ask Charlie to bring in the one from where he works, and we didn't know ahead of time." So you got to be real specific.
You really do. You have to ask. One last thing, and that is ask ahead of time. Make sure that you talk with them. Make sure you understand what equipment they have, what version of PowerPoint they have. If you're just going to take your file on a jump drive, it better be compatible with their version of PowerPoint. If it's not, it isn't going to work. If you're on a Mac, make sure that you understand the problems of going from a Mac to a PC. If you're on a PC and they're on a Mac, make sure you understand the font problems and all the things that can happen. You just have to ask questions and be prepared for technical problems. They are going to happen to you. I'm telling you right now. You are not going to avoid them. You've got to learn to deal with them, and you better have a backup plan. We'll pick up on some distractions while presenting on Thursday, and we'll get into some technical aspects of how to actually put this all stuff together. We're going to look at some graphic techniques and show you how to make some backgrounds and do some fun stuff. So, thanks a lot.
Are we going to start the